What if the ground itself declared war? Not with tanks or missiles, but with silent, perfect coordination. Your enemy wouldn't be a single nation, but billions moving as one, everywhere you set your feet. There are around 20 quadrillion ants on Earth. That's a number so large it feels like a myth. Now, give them human-level intelligence and a single, chilling objective: defeat humanity. The battlefield is no longer a place. It's the entire planet. They wouldn't start with a roar. They'd start with knowledge. Smart ants would map our lives the way they already map soil: our cracks, our thresholds, our daily rhythms. They'd learn when our cities sleep, when trucks idle, when the lights change. They would watch the heat signatures of our power transformers, feel the vibrations of our water pipelines, and track the daily pulse of our food supply. From this mountain of data, they would build a war plan based on timing, not brute force. Their communication would become a silent, invisible storm. Today, ants speak through chemicals called pheromones, through touch and through vibrations. With a human mind, that evolves into a complex language with its own grammar. Scent-based sentences carrying precise orders, attack windows, and retreat routes would fill the air. Tap codes would travel through the beams and ductwork of our buildings. Underground post offices would collect and forward signals like a living, breathing internet. There would be no grand speeches or radio broadcasts. Just orders that move faster than we could ever react, through channels we don't even know exist. The first strikes would look like simple inconveniences, the kind of bad luck that makes you sigh. Grocery stock spoils in one neighborhood. A power substation overheats in another. A hospital experiences a sudden spike in false fire alarms because a few ants bridged a sensor just enough to mimic smoke. Each event would be small, forgettable, and easily fixable in an afternoon. But these events wouldn't stop. They would stack up, one after another, day after day. Our logistics, the lifeblood of modern society, would begin to wobble. Delivery drivers would be late. Repair crews would be stretched thin. Managers would be exhausted. Ants don't need a single, overwhelming blow. They just need 1,000 tiny nudges aimed at our most critical, load-bearing points until the whole system starts to groan under the strain. Then they'd focus on food, but not ours at first, theirs. Like master strategists preparing for a long siege, smart ants would secure their own supply lines. Their underground fungus farms would go deeper. Their seed caches would be spread out. The aphid herds they tend would be rotated like livestock to avoid detection. They would build pantries behind moisture barriers and create insect guard lines that only colony members could cross. So when the war tightens, they won't panic. Their food stores are already in place. Now they'd turn their attention to us. Our farms would become pressure points. The ants wouldn't just strip a field bare, they would fracture an entire season. They'd target seed germination in one valley, the flowering of crops in another, and the harvest in a third. They wouldn't aim for total ruin, just enough loss to demand emergency shipments, to drain our fuel reserves, and to command our attention. And every time we rushed to put out one fire, they'd start another in the gap we left behind. Our governments would blame bad weather and poor luck. The ants would call it a win. What happens when we fight back with poison? They'd adapt. Scout ants would taste the bait, retreat, and signal a delayed kill alert to the colony. Carrier ants would isolate contaminated individuals. Grooming crews would clean survivors in designated quarantine chambers. Entire sub-colonies would go dark for a week to see if a particular route has become lethal. They would catalog the active ingredients in our poisons by smell and microtexture, then simply route their forces around them, or even bait us into wasting more. We would amplify our efforts, they would record our methods, and the next wave would slip through the very gaps we created with our own hands. They would weaponize the very space beneath our feet. Tunnels would be dug to undercut roads, just enough to create a sinkhole after a heavy truck passes. Not everywhere, just on the key route that feeds a major distribution hub. The expansion joints in our bridges would be packed with grit, causing friction to build, movement to grind, and maintenance costs to spike. We'd blame budget cuts and the weather. The ants would just call it another Tuesday. They wouldn't attack our bodies first, they'd attack our patience. Elevators would mysteriously fail on the hottest days. Data centers would run just a few degrees warmer, pushing systems to their limits. Wastewater would backflow on busy holiday weekends. People would get angry, then tired, then careless. And for the ants, carelessness is an open door. In our cities, they would conquer the seams. Smart ants wouldn't pour across our floors like a scene from a horror movie. They would live in the margins, behind baseboards, under the lips of gaskets, between drywall and electrical conduit. They would learn the cleaning schedule of every building on the block and simply be elsewhere when the brooms arrived. They'd move diagonally through the urban grid, up a riser, across a ceiling beam, down a utility chase, so that no exterminator could ever clear an entire floor. We would declare victory in a hallway while losing the building by inches. Midway through this silent war, a critical question would emerge. If this superorganism offered us a truce, a peace treaty in exchange for control over our corridors, our compost, and our timing, would we even consider it? Or are we so certain of our own dominance that we'd continue fighting a species that doesn't sleep and never gets tired? If we escalate, they won't meet us head-on. If we try to fortify our world, sealing cracks, bulldozing nests, flooding tunnels, the smart ants won't duel. They'll disperse. They'll abandon the obvious mound and scatter to 30 smaller outposts, all linked by capillary passages we can't see. They would build sponge layers in their nests that absorb floods and collapse safely when we inject foam, creating the illusion of a victory while the living city simply flows around our attack. Our triumphs would become decoys they engineered for our morale. Eventually, they might even recruit allies without ever signing a treaty. It wouldn't happen with words, but with outcomes. Farms suddenly spared from locusts because ants redirected the swarm with scent screens. Orchards heavily pollinated after ants discouraged competing pests. A town that never seems to flood because, underfoot, the ants have restructured the soil to absorb and slow the rain. The people in those places would start to question the war. They'd start leaving their compost in designated bins. They'd mow their lawns less, plant cover crops, and switch to pest control methods that the ants ignore. Collaboration would appear, not driven by a change of heart, but by simple, undeniable relief. The final battlefield would be underground. Our subways, culverts, storm drains, and fiber optic ducts. The ants would turn our own arteries into their highways. They'd learn the pulse of trains, crossing the tracks in the silent moment when the pressure drop warns of an arrival. They'd build tiny ladders from grit and resin that let them switch levels without ever surfacing. Entire armies could move through a city completely unseen, arriving directly beneath the one building that matters, the one that anchors the power grid, supplies the water, or houses a critical server farm. And they'd never have to climb a single stair. War would stop being about line of sight. It would become about line of soil. So what does victory even look like in a war between humanity and intelligent ants? It's not extinction. It's not conquest. It's terms. We get the light, the stories, and the upper floors. They get the seams, the soil, the timing of the planet's smallest logistics. We would call it public health and urban resilience. They would simply call it stability. The dangerous middle ground, where we insist on total control and they insist on total infiltration. That SA scenario that never ends well for anyone. Here's the final thought. Power isn't just about force. It's the ability to choose where the fight happens and how long it lasts. If ants ever thought like we do and chose to fight, they wouldn't crush us. They would simply outlast us. One corridor at a time, one schedule at a time, until we either learned to design a world that leaves them nothing to exploit, or learned to write a treaty with the ground beneath our feet. Thanks for watching. What do you think? In that world, would you keep swinging at shadows, or would you negotiate with the seams? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more ideas that challenge the world as you know it.